In Lesson 1, we're going to begin looking at field properties. We'll start with field size. We're going to begin today by learning about field properties. Now, every table is made up of one or more fields. The fields actually store your data. Each field has properties associated with it that allow you to do things like change the way the data is stored, or change what kinds of data can be stored in that field, or change the way the data is displayed on the screen, perhaps on a report or a form that you build off of this table. There are lots of things you can do with different field properties. So let's open up our customer table and go into Design View. Now you can either double-click on Customer Table to open it, and then click on this button here to switch to Design View, or, let me close that, you can just right-click on the Customer T right here and go into Design View off of this menu. Either way, it brings you to the same point. Now up top here are our different fields, Customer ID, first name, last name, and so on. Down below here on the bottom are the field properties. Now there are lots of different field properties, and these will change depending on what kind of field you're dealing with. Numbers, for example, have some different properties than text fields. Some of the properties you're going to use all the time. Others are a lot more advanced. Now I'll warn you in advance, we're going to cover some of these properties today. I'm going to save some of them for the expert classes. I know sometimes people don't like to hear that when I say we'll talk about this in a future lesson, but trust me, today we're going to learn about some of the basic field properties. Some of them are a lot more advanced, and we'll talk about them later. Remember, you have to learn how to walk before you learn how to run. Let's start by taking a look at our customer ID auto number. Click on customer ID, and down here on the bottom, you'll see the field properties for auto numbers. There's field size, new values, format, and so on. The first option here, field size, for auto numbers, you're pretty much going to always leave this set to long integer. There are two options in here, and if you drop this box down, you'll see there's long integer and replication ID. Now, don't worry about replication ID right now. That actually has to do with creating something called a database replica, which Access 2010 really doesn't even use anymore. That goes back to an older version of Access, but it's just here for backward compatibility. So you're always going to leave your auto numbers set to a long integer. Remember, we learned a little bit about long integers back in Level 1. We'll talk more about them in a few minutes. Now, field size makes a lot more sense for some of the other data types. For example, click on the first name field here, and you'll see the field size changes to 255. What does that mean? Well, if you remember back to Level 1, I mentioned that text fields can store any number of characters from 1 up to 255. Generally, you can leave this number set to 255. However, you can reduce the size if you want to limit the size of data that goes into your database. Now, back in the old days, 10, 20 years ago, when computers were very expensive and hard drive space was at a premium, database programmers wanted to make sure that the field sizes were large enough to store the data that needed to go in the field, but not too large, because megabytes were very expensive. And when your average hard drive size was 20 or 30 megabytes, you had to be very careful about the information that you could store in your database. Every little byte counted. However, today, we've got multi-terabyte hard drives, and the space is cheap. So you can set this to 255 if you want to. If you really want to optimize your database, you can go through it and set these numbers a little bit lower. For example, first name, I don't know too many first names that are 255 characters long. So I might drop this down to, say, 20 characters. That's plenty of space to store just about the longest first name field that I can possibly think of. Last names, they can be a bit longer. Let's come down here, maybe set this to 30. Company names can be pretty long. I'll set mine to 100 characters. Address, yeah, those can be long too. Let's go 100. City, I'd probably say 20 is long enough for most city names. Now, state is up to you. If most of your customers are in the United States and Canada, we use two-digit abbreviations to represent our states or provinces. You could come down here and set this to 2. If you're in a different country and your states don't have two-digit abbreviations, set that to whatever you want to. Again, for the purposes of class, I'm going to set this to 2 because I'm going to show you some tricks later on where that relies on that being 2. But if you want to leave it 5 or 10 or 20, that's fine. Again, one of the benefits of building your own Access database is you can customize it however you want. I'm going to leave my state set at 2 characters. And of course, at this time, the question always comes up, can you make that a drop-down list where you can pick a state from a list of states? Yes, absolutely you can. We will talk about that in a future class. The postal code field, again, depends on you. The zip code here in the United States is 5 characters long with an optional 4-character zip plus 4 code, they call it. Personally, I don't do a lot of mailings, and I don't really bother with the zip plus 4 myself. If you live in Canada or UK, your postal code is 6 characters. So I'm going to put in here 6 characters. That's going to cover most of my customers. Again, if your postal codes are different, feel free to change it. If you do handle a lot of mailings and you want to store that zip plus 4, you could make the postal code 9 characters long, or I sometimes make it a second field. Have a zip code field and then a zip plus 4 field. Keep them separate. Again, however you want to handle it is fine. I'm going to set it to 6 for my database. Country can be a little longer. Maybe set that to 30. Some country names are long. Now, email and website don't have a field size property. Those are hyperlinks. They're stored internally a little bit different. We'll talk more about the restrictions of a hyperlink field in a future class. We do have one more text field right here. That's our phone number. Now again, here in the United States, all of our phone numbers are 10 digits. We have a 3-digit area code, a 3-digit prefix, and a 4-digit suffix. So I'm going to set my field size to 10. If you deal with international numbers, you want to store country codes, again, you can either make that a separate field or just make your phone number text field longer. However you want to do it, that's completely up to you. Now, people always ask me, is this necessary? It's not critical. It's something that I like to do when I'm finished with a database. I'll go back through, take all the text fields especially, and set them so they're not too big. Basically, a big database is a slow database. And if you've got a lot of empty, wasted space in your database, it's going to run slower. Now, when you add text fields to your database, if they're all set to 255 characters and you're only using 2, like an estate field, that's a lot of wasted space. If you had 10,000 records and there's 253 wasted space characters in there for all those state fields, that's many megabytes worth of data. And of course, that's going to make your database run slow, especially if it's over a network. Now, there is something that I'm going to show you called compacting your database, which is basically like sticking your foot down on a garbage can. It takes all the wasted space and it basically deletes it. If that information isn't being used, Access will reclaim the space. However, unless you do this every day, your database is going to start running slower if you've got a lot of empty space in there. If you add a bunch of records, remember, as you add those records, Access reserves all that space. I generally go through and compact my database maybe once a month. I don't add a ton of new data to it. But it is a good step to go through and make sure that all of your text field sizes especially aren't too big. That will save you some time in the long run. But we will talk about compacting your database in an upcoming lesson. In a nutshell, if you have lots and lots of empty space in your database, it's going to run slower, and compacting your database will make it run faster. Primarily at this point, you can use the field size property for text fields to prevent people from typing in lots and lots of data into text fields that shouldn't be there. For example, the phone number field. You wouldn't want someone typing in a 150-character phone number. That would just be silly. So you can set the phone number to 10 to limit their data. One thing to note is your notes field. It's a memo field. It does not have a field size. Remember, you don't set the field size for a notes field, a memo field, because it stores pretty much as much data as you need to go in that field. It can store up to 64 kilobytes. That's about 65,000 characters of data. Lots and lots of information can go into a memo field. Now, another data type that does have a field size is the number data type. Right down here you can see it says field size long integer. Again, we talked a little bit about these in level 1. We set num employees equal to a long integer. We set discount rate equal to a double. If we drop this box down right here, you can see all the different field sizes for number fields. Basically, you have two groups of number values. You have integer values and floating point values, or values with a decimal point. For the integers, we have byte, integer, and long integer. A byte can be any value from 0 to 255. So a small value like number of children would be fine stored in a byte value. Integer can be plus or minus about 32,000. So that can store most numbers that you're going to use on a daily basis. Long integers can store plus or minus 2 billion, roughly. Now for floating point values, we've got single, double, and decimal. Now a single can store 3.4 times 10 to the 38th power. Basically, that's a 1 with 38 zeros after it, times 3.4, roughly. So it's a pretty big number. Doubles are much, much larger than that, 10 to the 308th power. So that's pretty big. Decimals are special. You can actually set the precision. We'll talk about decimals in a future class. There are some weird rules that go along with decimals. Decimals can actually give you a little more control over the value, but for most intents and purposes, it's not necessary. Now, what should you use? What you're going to use right now for all of your number values is either a long integer or a double. Don't worry about any of the rest of the data types. Singles, bytes, integers, don't worry about that. We'll talk about the specific differences between all the different data types in the expert series. For now, all you have to worry about is if you need a decimal point, use a double. If you don't need a decimal point, use a long integer. It's that simple. And that's why we stored number of employees as a long integer. Hey, a big company like General Motors might need a long integer to store the number of employees. And discount rate, we set it as a double because I need to store numbers like 5%, which is stored internally as 0.05. So I need a floating point number for that. For the curious, yes, a currency value is technically a number value, but the field size has been internally optimized for dealing with dollar values. And again, we'll talk more about that in the expert classes. But yes, definitely select the currency data type if you're dealing with money. Now let's go ahead and save our table. I'm going to hit Control S on my keyboard, or you can click on the Save button up on the Quick Access toolbar. Now when I do, I get this warning message. It says some data may be lost. The setting for the field size property for one or more of the fields has changed to a shorter size. Basically what this is saying is you shrunk down some of your field sizes, so if you do have any information in those fields longer than the specified size, that information will be lost. So let's say, hypothetically, you had a 12-digit name and you changed the name size to 10 characters. Well, it would chop off and you'd lose those 2 extra characters. But this shouldn't be a problem. I'm going to go ahead and say yes. And now my table is saved. So that's all for now on field sizes. Again, the important things, set your text fields. You want them long enough to store the longest bit of data, but not too long. And set your number field sizes to either long integer or double.